Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the Royal College for having me, and what an amazing place to give a lecture. The University of East Anglia is a 60s university, and it doesn't look like this, so this is very nice. And thank you to all of you. It's so nice to see so many people come out to hear a bit about the Tudors on a kind of fairly wet Wednesday evening. And thank you very much. A couple of other last thank yous to my parents who are here, who provide very important logistical support in the last week where I got COVID and recovered. It was all a bit touch and go. And to my very important Scottish family. I am a graduate of St Andrews. That's where I became a historian. And when 25 years ago I knocked on the door of my neighbour next to me, I didn't think I'd be meeting my lifelong best friend. So Lindsay and her parents, Barbara and David, thank you so much for everything. Okay, so let's think about the Tudors and killing them off, most importantly. We've established we're all fans of death. At some point between 1503 and 1509, Henry VII, the victor of the Battle of Bosworth and the founding father of the Tudor dynasty, commissioned a new altarpiece for his private chapel at Richmond Palace. At this point, Henry had been on the throne for at least 18 years, and although he didn't know it at that point, his dynasty would wear the crown for nearly another century. His son, Henry VIII, and his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would become two of the most famous monarchs in English history, with an assured place in popular culture from horrible histories to Wolf Hall and everything in between. All this was still very much in the future, as Henry VII approved a design for his new altarpiece. Henry had sufficient funds at this stage to employ a very skilled Flemish artist for the job, rather than make do with the limited talents of a homegrown English painter. This flashing of cash in a monarch known for his penny pinching suggests that the project was something really close to the king's heart. The commission was for his own private chapel, an altarpiece image to provide the focal point for his own personal prayers. Very few people beyond the king's family and close confidants would have used this space. And Henry's choice of image, therefore, was deeply personal, and it tells us a lot about him. Here is Henry VII, and here is his finished altarpiece. Now, in many ways, when you look at this, it's a rather strange-looking altarpiece. I think the most obvious thing that makes it strange is it's not particularly religious. You might expect the Virgin Mary, you might expect Christ as a focal point for a prayer in a chapel. It is true that we have a hovering angel here, and a dragon slaying St. George here, and behind we have a Princess Clotilde and her pet lamb, who is the princess that George is saving from the dragon. But apart from that, we don't have much in this image that is about the religion of that moment, Roman Catholicism. And for me, when I look at this, the first thing that strikes me about it is the military setting. For a religious image, this is a very military image as well. We're clearly on a battlefield here. And the reason you can tell that is we're obviously watching St. George at work, but in the middle foreground, we have campaign tents here, so the kind of tent that would be pitched on the field of battle, bedecked here in the Tudor colours of red and white, and with Tudor roses, the red and white rose, and the Tudor portcullis, one of their heraldic symbols there. And of course, nothing could be more fitting for a king who had so recently won his throne on the field at Bosworth in 1485. It reminds us that Henry was really proud of this victory, and to him it was a victory granted by God. But most prominent, particularly if you were sitting kneeling in front of this at prayer, are the line of figures arrayed in the foreground here. The angel is lifting the tent flaps, which I think you can make out here in either hand, to reveal on either side the family of Henry VII. At the centre, facing one another, are Henry and his wife, Elizabeth of York, both in front of an altar, just as the real king, the real-life king, would have been as he stared up at this image. Their royal status is emphasised by their crowns imperial that they're wearing, matching orbs, and a sceptre for the king. On either side are their children, boys behind their father and girls behind their mother. Here are the princes on one side, Arthur, Henry, and Edmund, and on the other side, the princesses, Margaret, Elizabeth, Mary, and Catherine. Nothing signals stability of a monarchy more than a plentiful royal family. And here we have male heirs aplenty and a useful selection of daughters for the international marriage market. Or do we? What's crucial about this is the dating of the image. It was created in the years after 1503. They've done dendrochronology to this image, so they've x-rayed the wood and they've taken bits of the wood to get a sense of when the panel was felled, which gives a fairly close time limit of when it might have been painted. And by 1503, Henry VII had suffered severe and multiple loss. His infant baby daughter, Elizabeth, had died in 1495. His third son, Edmund, had succumbed to plague as a baby in 1500, but the greatest losses were yet to come. In 1502, Henry's eldest son and his heir, Prince Arthur, died, aged just 15. This loss was absolutely devastating. When their news of the son's death was delivered to his parents, Elizabeth of York fell to her knees, and King Henry tried his best to console her through his own profound sorrow, as their courtiers looked on, utterly aghast. In Arthur, their golden prince, had rested all Henry VII's hopes for a new golden age of Tudor peace and prosperity. With the possibility of female succession being little more than absolutely fantastical, the future of the Tudor dynasty now rested on one last surviving son. And remember that with the Wars of the Roses still firmly within living memory at this point, this was too big a risk to bear. So in 1502, at the age of 36, Elizabeth of York fell pregnant again, in an attempt to shore up the future with another male heir. But this was not to be. Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, Catherine, on the 2nd of February 1503, and the baby survived for just 2 days. 9 days later, Elizabeth of York herself succumbed to sepsis. Henry VII was absolutely shattered. A courtier wrote, and I quote, that the king privily departed to a solitary place, and would no man should resort unto him. But let's return to the altarpiece and consider the question we're therefore facing. Why did Henry VII choose to include his deceased wife and children in this painting, as if they were still alive? Well, largely, of course, this would have been for comfort. Remember that this was an altarpiece in a private chapel, and it must have helped soothe the king's cavernous sense of loss to remember his family during moments of private worship. But the painting soothed in a different way as well. By 1503, the Tudor dynasty, minted just 18 years before at Bosworth, looked increasingly precarious. Henry VII had lost his wife, and this was more than losing just the host for his unborn heirs. The death of Elizabeth of York fractured the very alliance between the houses of York and Lancaster that had ended the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII himself had seen off 2 challenges to his throne in pitched battles since Bosworth in 1487 and again in 1497. Would there now be more of these challenges to come? The king was increasingly unpopular with both the English nobility and the London merchant class for his punitive financial measures. Henry VII was in his late 40s at this point, and his fledgling dynasty hung by a single thread. Everything now rested on the survival of his one remaining son, Prince Henry. The king saw threat and opposition everywhere and became increasingly paranoid. In this febrile atmosphere, the monarchy looked so weak that the renewal of the civil wars appeared likely, if not inevitable. The Tudor project was teetering on the very brink of failure. But for a short while, in private, Henry could pretend otherwise. He understood an old and essential truth. Continuity was the very essence of dynasty. At prayer, shut away from the cares of reality, Henry could pretend that the wife and 7 children he gazed at so lovingly were the keepers of a safe and secure Tudor crown. Looking at this altarpiece, he could believe, just for a short moment, that he had done enough, that he had succeeded, that there would be a succession. So as we leave poor old Henry VII to quiet prayers for his lost family, we have arrived at one of the inherent contradictions of monarchy itself. To be successful as a system of government, monarchy depends on continuity. Much of monarchy's power, as we've so recently witnessed, is bound up in its sense of tradition and custom and permanence. One way of understanding this is in the traditional idea borrowed from France in the medieval period of the king is dead, long live the king. This is sometimes referred to as the notion of the king's two bodies. This theory was usefully summed up by a lawyer called Edward Plowden in Elizabeth I's reign in the 1560s. He wrote, "The king has in him two bodies, viz., a body natural and a body politic. His body natural is a body mortal, subject to all infirmities that come by nature or accident, but his body politic is a body that cannot be seen or handled, consisting of policy and government and constituted for the direction of the people and the management of the public weal. And this body is utterly void of infancy and old age and of other natural defects and imbecilities which the body natural is subject to." This is a wordy, very 16th century way of saying that the individual king, and the emphasis is on king, not on queen, may die, but the crown carries on forever. There is an easier way to understand this. I'm hoping that many of you might be familiar with this. This was a stalwart of my childhood, one of my prized possessions as history geek in the making. This is a ruler, which was very much prized, although this is an updated version because this includes Charles III. Now, these are available in all good National Trust shops and heritage gift site shops, this one from Westminster Abbey, and I did check that Scottish versions are also available. As you can see, this is the English version. We have a ruler, very simply, listing all the monarchs of England with their regnal dates. Now, to state the obvious about this, the point of a ruler is to be straight and continuous. What better place, then, to list the wearers of the English crown in an unbroken list from 1066 until today, so strange little pseudo-historians like me can memorize them all. The implication is that just like the ruler, monarchy is, therefore, a straight line from William the Conqueror to Charles III. Now, I might be overthinking this, and I had a ruler when I was very young, so I've had a long time to think about this. And I might be overreaching to claim that the ruler is the greatest piece of monarchical propaganda ever created, but I'd argue that it's actually not that far off. Because that's exactly what it is. It's a near-perfect example of the theory of monarchy. But hold on, it's not actually true, is it? Because have a closer look. It's true that the list has to sort of include the Commonwealth of England between 1649 and 1660, after they had executed Charles I, but the beheading of an anointed monarch doesn't receive much fanfare here. But there are other hidden problems. What about all the other times when the crown was not peacefully passed down in an unbroken link from father to son, or at a push from father to daughter, and kept within the immediate family? You don't have to look far beneath the surface here to find numerous times when this just simply wasn't the case. And here are some examples. Let's start at the beginning. What about William the Conqueror? The clue's in the name. Or what about the deposition of Richard II by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV? Or the frankly messy period of the Wars of the Roses, when the crown was thrown back and forth between Henry VI and Edward IV? What about the murder of Edward V, the older of the princes in the Tower, on the command of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III? What about Henry VII's own victory on the Battle of Bosworth? Or Queen Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign? What about the arrival of Mary and William in 1689, or the Hanoverians in 1714? Even in the 20th century, what about Edward VIII's abdication to swan off into the sunset with Wallis Simpson? Now, I've definitely overlooked others, but we're basically tripping over ourselves with examples of monarchy not being a continuous thread. As ever, reality is much messier and normally doesn't fit on a ruler. But for monarchy to work, we have to pretend that it can. So, on the one hand, people needed to believe that monarchy was a stable and powerful system of government, particularly when that government was actually led by the monarch themselves. In the early modern period, monarchy was personal. The quality of government depended on the quality of the person sitting on the throne. But at the same time, people did know about its fragility because they lived this fragility through civil war, through usurpation, through untimely or suspicious death. And this is why two contradictory but connected things happened at once during the Tudor century. There was an absolute obsession, as we'll see, with the projection of monarchical power. And I would argue that one of the reasons that the Tudors remain a topic that would draw an audience on a wet Wednesday is because they are still culturally very powerful. But at the same time, more quietly, often behind closed doors and in ambiguous terms, the people of Tudor England worried incessantly about the health, sickness, gender, and longevity of their monarch. And this is what drove them, in the words of a usurped king, Shakespeare's Richard II, to sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Now, let us shift our attention to that menacing behemoth of the Tudor age, Henry VIII. It turned out, of course, that Henry VII's last remaining son did survive, and he acceded to the throne in 1509. At this point, Henry VIII was a handsome, educated, and athletic 17-year-old who had yet to develop a taste for murdering his wives or for terrorizing his subjects. Surely now, the Tudor dynasty's future was golden. Well, not exactly. But one thing Henry VIII would have is instant recognizability. The great 20th century scholar of Tudor history, Geoffrey Elton, said that Henry VIII was the only English monarch identifiable just by his shape. And in one way, above all others, Henry VIII had an incredible stroke of luck because one of his court painters was Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein, surely one of the most gifted artists of the 16th century, created Henry VIII's image. How many people, for example, would recognize this as Henry VIII so automatically? Not, I think, as many as would recognize this as Henry VIII. And this is Holbein's pièce de résistance. This is the Whitehall mural. What we're looking at here is not the mural itself. This is a rather second-hand copy because the mural itself, painted onto a wall at Whitehall Palace, was destroyed by fire in 1698. And so it doesn't give us quite the sense, the immediacy of Holbein's work. The original artwork, which was slightly larger than life in its scale, with the figure of Henry VIII, obviously bottom left, standing at over 6 foot tall, was commissioned by the king to be painted directly onto the wall of his privy chamber in his favourite palace of Whitehall at Westminster. The privy chamber, as the name suggested, did have a sense of restricted access, but it was still a very important room of state. It was here that Henry VIII would receive his most important guests and European ambassadors, sitting enthroned in a very Henry VIII way in front of an image, a larger-than-life image of himself. The mural was very much intended to send a message. It was commissioned at some point between May 1536 and October 1537, during Henry VIII's brief marriage to his third wife, pictured here, Jane Seymour. At this stage, Henry had already taken the absolutely extraordinary step of rejecting the Roman Catholic Church and founding his new separate renegade Church of England. He'd taken this action in order to marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry had ordered Anne Boleyn's execution just days before he celebrated his wedding to Jane Seymour, seen here. And although he was now 46 years of age and 28 years into his reign, he had a massive problem. He still did not have a male heir. Yes, he had 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. At this point, he'd actually made both of them illegitimate. But the Tudor dynasty was still gazing into the abyss of its own termination. So when Holbein arrived at court to discuss the composition and design of the mural with the king, he was taking on a project of vital importance. Henry needed the mural to amplify and project his power. It needed to distract the people standing before it from the absence of a male heir. It needed to demonstrate Tudor monarchy's strength, its continuity, and its stability, and how Holbein rose to this challenge. The setting of the mural is likely to have reflected the decoration of the Privy Chamber itself. The idea was that it would trick the eye, that actually if Henry weren't sitting on the throne, you could almost imagine he were by just gazing at the mural, see him standing before you here. This was meant to be a continuity of the space to give you a sense that you were in his very presence, even he shouldn't be there. Dominating the foreground, of course, we have Henry on the left and his wife Jane Seymour on the right. Henry is in what most of us, I think, would recognise as Henry VIII pose, hands on hips and legs astride. And definitely it's very key to any actor playing Henry VIII to stand in that kind of power pose. He is, of course, a figure of pure virility here. His much admired shapely calves, Henry VIII was obsessed with his own calves, much admired shapely calves on display, his shoulders broadened by that great padded coat, and his great height. And, of course, his very prominent codpiece. And we know from the changes made to Holbein's original drawing, in prep here, that the codpiece was in fact enlarged to be made more prominent. So, although the original is lost, this was the underdrawing. So what Holbein would do is he sketched this all out, and then he would use a needle to prick through all the outlines here into the wall so he could trace the outline before he painted the mural, and this still exists in the National Gallery in London. And from this we can see the artist working. We could see how the portrait developed through, presumably, conversations with the king. And the king decided the codpiece was not prominent enough, had to be made more prominent. And we know that when the Whitehall mural was unveiled, people were shocked about this. Never be shocked by Henry VIII, I say. And with that sort of codpiece, the point is, and with a codpiece like that, a wife like the demure Jane Seymour, surely nobody could doubt that Henry would soon be producing those male heirs. Standing behind are Henry's own parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. The mural is essentially a 16th century version of the ruler. The past and present of the Tudor dynasty arrayed out before us with an expectation of a new generation ahead. Everything here is about dynasty, about tradition, continuity, and stability. And just in case the visuals weren't enough, Holbein was tasked specifically by Henry with including a whacking grey altarpiece in the middle of the painting. Upon this stone tablet, its self-emphasizing permanence, Henry VIII himself composed an inscription detailing just how brilliant he was. And crucially, the message on this tablet is aimed not just at his English guests, but for anybody who might be in the chamber. How do we know? Because it was written in Latin and not in English. Holbein's depiction of Henry VIII was so successful that it became shorthand for monarchical power and authority. Even during Henry's reign, artists were given permission to enter the Privy Chamber to sketch the imposing figure of the king. And we have the surviving copy of the mural itself because Charles II, a king much occupied with imbuing the newly restored Restoration monarchy with authority, commissioned this second-rate copy. The ongoing, almost everlasting influence of this image is testament to its success. It's impossible to think of any actor playing Henry VIII on screen or on stage who doesn't wear this outfit, adopt this pose at some stage. Holbein's Henry very quickly became a symbol of that theory of monarchy as an unbroken, powerful, stable form of government. As Henry VIII's physical body fell into irreversible decline in 1547, great care was taken to give his son, the 9-year-old Edward, the Holbein treatment. Have a look at this. This is a portrait. It was painted sometime around 1547, but it's a bit hard to pinpoint exactly when. We're either talking weeks before or very shortly after Edward has become King of England. But what's immediately clear about this is that it was much more important that the viewer understand Edward as a miniature Henry VIII, reincarnated, than it was to have any sense of what Edward might have been, or what he looked like even as an individual. Everything here the clothing. He's basically wearing a kind of miniature fancy dress outfit of what Henry had been wearing in the Holbein. The setting, the stance, it's all straight from Holbein. We are being invited to believe that all is well. Tudor monarchy is safe and stable, and despite the throne being perched upon by a very young child. At this stage, Edward was just 9 years old. The Tudors felt the need to control their image and perfect their depiction of strong and stable monarchy precisely because their reality was so fragile. Alongside the propaganda of strength came the whispered reality of frailty and weakness, and both came to shape public perception. As much as our old friend, the lawyer Edward Plowden, wanted us to believe that the king, always a king, not a queen, had two bodies, one representing the government and one the individual, it was impossible for even him to deny that those physical bodies really were subject to sickness, aging, and ultimately death. And although people were supposed to believe that this didn't matter, that individual monarchs were just part players in the great production of monarchy itself, this didn't really ring true. For over half the Tudor century, the Wars of the Roses remained in living memory. And by the end of the century, the high crisis moments of, amongst others, the reign of Richard II, Henry VI, and Richard III, were being regularly played out to packed audience crammed into London theatres to watch Shakespeare's most recent history plays. These moments were becoming the stuff of legend precisely because they played to people's fears about instability. It is in this context that we need to understand the widespread obsession with the physical health of the Tudor monarchs themselves. Let's first stop to consider ill health and accident. On the 24th of January 1536, Henry VIII was taking part in that ultimate challenge of physical prowess and virility, jousting. He'd always loved jousting, and he'd excelled at it, fearless in nature and certain in his own ability, and also people being told that they mustn't on any circumstances hurt him because he was the king. So even when he was fighting in disguise, everyone had a tip-off that they had to be very careful. But this hadn't quite gone right on the 24th of January. Though not yet the 52-inch girth he was going to become, Henry was at this point now 44 years old and firmly in Tudor middle age. And the outing, as I say, did not go as planned. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, said that the king, being mounted on a great horse to run at the lists, both the horse and the king, fell so heavily that everyone thought it a miracle he was not killed, but he sustained no injury. A French source related that Henry had been for 2 hours without speaking. Given that the king and his horse would have been wearing heavy armour and that the fall would have taken place at high speed, it looks like this had been a very narrow escape. But there were consequences. At this point, Henry VIII had no male heir. His current wife, Anne Boleyn, had to keep up, Anne Boleyn was pregnant, and her shock at the news of Henry's accident was so great that, as a contemporary commentator wrote, I quote, "She took such a fright with it all that it caused her to fall in travail and was so delivered afore her full time, which was a great discomfort to all the realm." Or, to put it in the brutal shorthand of the French ambassador, Anne was so upset that she miscarried a son. The king had survived, but an heir had died. A discomfort to all the realm indeed. It is little wonder then that this moment, when the Tudor dynastic project might have been derailed entirely, has fixed in the minds of posterity. Though, by contemporary accounts, the king did not appear to have been severely injured, he did possibly reopen an existing leg ulcer. This accident is often pointed to, often with no real historical evidence, as the moment Henry VIII experienced some sort of personality shift and became the tyrant of popular imagination. Over a quarter of a century on, there was another narrow escape, this time for Elizabeth I, the only surviving child of Anne Boleyn, who had become queen in 1558. Less than 4 years after she had come to the throne, in November 1562, Elizabeth felt the onset of aches and chills. She wrapped up her diplomatic correspondence early and did what I think many of us would do today. She had a bath, much rarer for the Tudors than us, I would say, and an early night, hoping to feel much better in the morning. But the Queen did not feel better, she got worse. Within days, her skin started to blister into the pus-filled sores confirming the terrifying truth. The Queen had smallpox, a disease which killed about 30% of those afflicted. And the timing could hardly have been worse. Elizabeth, though still young, was so far unmarried, and there were now no Tudor siblings left. Moreover, just 1 year before, Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Stuart, had returned from France to rule Scotland. If Elizabeth died, Mary Stuart was the logical successor, except for one major issue: her Roman Catholic faith. Was Elizabeth's death about to do more than break the ruler? Was it about to unleash wars of religion within the British Isles? Elizabeth's Privy Council was staring into another void, and they were not prepared to risk a Stuart succession. They took the extraordinary revolutionary steps of drawing up an agreement that if Elizabeth did die, the Privy Council would themselves make the choice about who should succeed her. So much for the continuity and stability of monarchy. Luckily, this never came to pass. Though Elizabeth did fall into a brief and rather terrifying coma, within 10 days she showed signs of recovery, and the nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. We can get a sense of how deep this relief ran by having a look at this. This is a medal minted specifically to celebrate Elizabeth's survival of smallpox. From how many remain, there are a number of these remaining, it gives us a sense that many of them must have been minted in the first place. This example, they must have been minted for some time actually, because this is minted 10 years later in 1571. So in 1571, they're still minting medals to celebrate her survival. On the one side, we see a portrait of the young queen, her face unblemished by scarring, really important given that she was still on the marriage market. On the other side, we see a snake representing Elizabeth's illness being cast into the fire by a divine hand. And the Latin inscription around the image reads, "If God be with us, who can be against us?" And the message was clear. Disaster had been averted by Elizabeth and England's Protestant God. But more interesting, for me at least, was the minting, and we must presume purchasing, of these medals. The collective relief at Elizabeth's survival was so great that people wanted souvenirs of it, or possibly even talisman, to protect themselves against just how transient Tudor dynastic power really was. This is a far remove from Holbein's image of monarchy. And this one, the worry inherent in the medal's origin, was the one that people chose to carry around in their pockets, or perhaps even to wear around their necks. This preoccupation, both contemporary and continuous, with the well-being of individual monarchs, went so far as to distort perceptions of them. Let's go back to Edward VI. Here he is as a baby, another amazing portrait by Holbein. And once again, I think it's clear to say that this portrait's really a bit more about Henry VIII than it is about his son. This was a portrait that Holbein painted as a gift for Henry VIII. The clothes, the hat, even the facial features all have something of Henry VIII about them. And I would say that this has got to be up there as the world's most impractical baby grow. Still, there could be no denying the health of this bonny baby. And Edward really was healthy, or at least as healthy as any 16th century baby could hope to be. But of course, fear stalked the royal nursery. And there was just one viable male heir to the Tudor dynasty, and he'd been such a long time coming. All Tudor dynastic hopes rested on this baby, and every care needed to be taken to protect him. In March 1539, a set of regulations was drawn up by the king himself, and the king even went so far as to annotate them, and Henry hated writing. So anytime you see his rather cramped hand on anything, you know he's taken personal interest. So he annotated these regulations himself on the care of Edward, who Henry referred to in this document as his most precious jewel, the one sweet thing that Henry VIII ever said, perhaps. These wide-ranging rules included detail about the placement of Edward's cot, the material of his clothing, and the number of people allowed contact with him. Each regulation was, of course, driven by the need to avoid infection. So when little Edward did fall ill, panic ensued. In autumn 1541, the now 4-year-old caught malaria at Hampton Court. The French ambassador described how, in a wild frenzy, Henry VIII summoned all the doctors in the country, including his own personal physician, the wonderfully named William Butts. When Dr. Butts asked the prince if he felt any disposition to vomit, the boy answered, sounding a lot like my own 4-year-old, "Go away, fool." But the precedent had been set. The whole court and the kingdom beyond it was on high alert. Every time Edward coughed, somebody made a note. And yet Edward's final illness, possibly TB, but it's very hard to know, only came on 5 months before his eventual death in 1553. In the years before, the zealous and perfectly healthy boy king had overseen a radical Protestant Reformation and even managed during his ailing final months personally to author a plot to hand the throne to Lady Jane Grey, thereby altering once again the course of English monarchy. And yet, because of the wide understanding of and deep-seated anxiety about the succession, concerns over Edward's health will forever cast him as the Tudor Lord Fauntleroy, sickly and wan, with no real will to live, a life destined to end at the age of 15. All this fuss for a male heir. Can you imagine the drama should a woman accede to the throne? And, of course, they do. It would turn out that Edward VI was the last Tudor king. His plot to disinherit his Tudor sisters did not prevail, and the next 2 monarchs would not be kings, but queens, Mary I, then Elizabeth I. And with them would come a whole new range of anxiety. As we've discussed, the absolute first priority for any monarch at this stage was to produce at least one heir, ideally 2, both male. For a king, whilst this might involve complicated marital manoeuvres, as exemplified so well by Henry VIII, the production of an heir did not pose an obvious threat to their own life. This was not the case for queens regnant, where the production of an heir meant getting pregnant, staying pregnant, and then giving birth. And of course, this was no easy feat. In the 16th century, the production of children was seen as something by which to judge a woman's success. And this was no different for a queen, though the stakes were much higher. You don't have to look far to find a history book that uses the most pejorative of terms to describe Mary I's torrid attempts to produce an heir from her marriage to the Habsburg prince Philip of Spain. The lack of an heir is often deemed Mary's own biggest failure. She is referred to as barren, and she is belittled for believing herself to be pregnant when she wasn't. All this speaks to the role of women within Tudor society. They existed to bear and then rear children, and if they couldn't, they were deemed unnatural and even slightly sinister, much like Mary I. But even if a royal woman did get pregnant, she faced the challenge of carrying the baby to term. Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, fell pregnant 6 times. Of these times, 1 child, the future Mary I, survived. A son, Prince Henry, lived for 2 weeks, and the other 4 pregnancies ended in either miscarriage or stillbirth. And aside from the survival of the baby, childbirth posed a significant risk of death to the mother. We've already met in the course of this lecture 2 royal women who died in childbirth. Henry VII's beloved wife, Elizabeth of York, and Henry VIII's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. Both contracted childbed fever, which was probably sepsis. Perhaps paradoxically, the danger of childbirth was greater for queens because they endured the ministrations of the male royal physician, who had much less practical experience or knowledge than the average village midwife. But at least if it was a royal wife that died in childbirth, they could be fairly easily replaced. What if it was the monarch herself? Elizabeth I, in the end, avoided this danger by remaining unmarried. We'll never know for certain why she made this choice. Perhaps, reasonably, she was traumatized by the knowledge that her father had executed her mother. Perhaps she thought her own authority would be diminished through marriage. After all, she is famed for telling her favourite, Robert Dudley, "I will have but one mistress and no master." Or perhaps it wasn't that she made a choice not to marry at all, but the choice was made for her by circumstance. Perhaps her counsel, could never agree on the advice they offered. Perhaps there was never the right candidate at the right moment. Perhaps matters of religion made the issue of marriage impossible. We do know from her own words that she had distinct reservations. When, in 1561, Maitland of Lethington, close advisor to Mary Stuart, pressed Elizabeth to name a successor, hoping, I think, that it would be Mary Stuart, the English queen snapped, "This desire is to set my winding sheet before my eye." In other words, by naming a successor, Elizabeth would be accepting the event of her own death, possibly even hastening it by giving those plotting against her to replace her with her Catholic cousin a bit of hope. A winding sheet, a coffin shroud, was a motif she returned to in the same conversation. She went on to say, recalling her own difficult childhood, that princes cannot like their own children. Think you I could love my own winding sheet? In other words, Elizabeth did not want to talk about the succession or marriage or even children because it made her think about her own death. Well, that's all very well, but where did it leave the people of England, the subjects to whom she always professed her endless loyalty? I'd argue that it left them in a state of increasing anxiety and paranoia. Elizabeth might not have been comfortable with the idea of her own death, but at least she did not face the prospect of living in the uncertain future beyond it. For the people of England, it already felt strange enough to have a woman on the throne, but it was quite something else to have an aging, childless woman on the throne. After about 1580, when Elizabeth was in her late 40s, it became clear that she was just not going to produce an heir, and there were no Tudor siblings left. Elizabeth would be the last. Elizabeth's subjects, particularly her courtiers, dealt with this by reshaping the image of their queen. Here was another attempt to close the gap between the fragile reality of Tudor monarchy and its image of power and security. Take a look at this portrait. There are many surviving portraits of Elizabeth I, and this is probably one of the most famous. This is the rainbow portrait, dating from about 1600 and attributed to the Flemish artist Marcus Gerhardt the Younger. By the time this portrait was painted, Elizabeth was at least 67 and a couple of years from her death in 1603. I think we'd all agree she's looking pretty good for 67. This is Elizabeth as Gloriana, an eternally youthful virgin goddess. She's holding a rainbow in her hand to demonstrate her power over nature, whilst her ageless face demonstrates her power over time. What's so crucial about this portrait is its context. As with many of the most famous portraits of Elizabeth, this was not commissioned by the Queen, as Henry VIII had commissioned Holbein, but by her own courtiers, in this case, the Cecil family. These courtiers knew why dynasty mattered to monarchy. Dynasty was intended to produce a simple succession, and a simple succession kept the monarchy on track, safe and secure. Disruption to dynasty, through extinction or usurpation, exposed the frailty at the heart of monarchy. And in those moments of disruption, civil war, rebellion, invasion, all the people of England might potentially suffer. So while as Elizabeth's courtiers might have muttered these fears in dark corners, they also put their heads firmly into the sand. By reinventing Elizabeth as Gloriana, as the Virgin Queen, the courtiers themselves were projecting an image of the Tudor dynasty as safe, serene, and immortal. Of course, Elizabeth could not defy time, and the Tudor dynasty came to an end with her death on the 24th of March, 1603. We can get a sense of how paranoid her counselors were about the potential breakdown of order in this ultimate moment of dynastic failure. The playhouses of London were all shut. This was not the moment for Shakespeare and his triggering history plays. A ban was imposed on unlawful assembly throughout the land. This was not the time for speculation nor idle gossip. And soldiers were drafted into London to keep extra watch. In the end, they needn't have worried. Now that the worst had happened, there was a widespread feeling of relief and even excitement about the succession of Elizabeth's cousin, James Stuart. He might not have been a Tudor, but he had something the Tudors had longed for across the 16th century. James had a wife and 3 children, including 2 sons, Henry and Charles. Very politic name choice. For now, the succession crisis was over and monarchy could march forward. I want to finish up by thinking a little bit about tomb monuments. A tomb monument was a monarch's very final say on their own reign and legacy. These monuments were planned during the monarch's lifetime and always had similar aims. Location was everything. The top spot kings and queens wanted was Westminster Abbey, that age-old shrine to the English monarchy. If you could bag a space near one of the more renowned kings, especially Edward the Confessor, a saint, or Henry V, the ultimate warrior, that was better still. The south transept of the abbey was deemed the most prestigious space, mainly because more monarchs were buried on that side. That was the really hot real estate. Once you decided on your spot, the ideal was to have the grandest, most up-to-date tomb monument possible. The more beautiful, the better. Everybody wanted to be on the tourist trail. But there was an obvious problem here. The completion of these grand designs would happen after a monarch's death. Sure, they'd normally made extensive plans which were elaborated upon in their will, but the translation of a body and the completion and crucial financing of these schemes depended entirely upon the new incumbent. In this sense, tomb monuments, or their absence, was all about succession. And here, at their end, the Tudors had very mixed success. Henry VII did very well. His tomb is one of the most spectacular in Westminster Abbey. The Tudor founding father put his dynasty on the map by building more than just a tomb. He built an entire chapel, an extension to Westminster Abbey just for him. He felt, in fact, that he wanted to be as close to Henry V as possible, and felt that he couldn't really move people. So he sort of built an annex out the back behind Henry V. So there's a whole chapel just for Henry VII. His tomb monument, seen here, cost the equivalent of several £million today and was sculpted by a Florentine master brought over specifically. This kind of metalwork couldn't be done in England at this point, so he paid for somebody to come over and have this done. And it's regularly described as the first Renaissance tomb in England. So far, so good. The Tudors are doing very well. Henry VIII was, of course, more than happy to honour his father's grand scheme, despite the expense, because he was keen to bolster the still fledgling Tudor credentials. Perhaps surprisingly, given how much we talk about him, Henry VIII did not fare so well. Henry VIII ended up interred anonymously until this plaque was put down, and this was only put down in 1837. He's buried in the choir of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, and he's down there alongside the bodies of, it's a rather ragtag assortment, James Seymour, Charles I, minus head, and a nameless child of Queen Anne, each a testament to failed dynastic ambition. Henry had, and who's surprised by this, designed an elaborate monument to himself, replete with larger-than-life equestrian statuaries, and Edward did progress this scheme for a while, but on his death, neither of his sisters felt inclined to spend so lavishly on a father with whom their relations had been complex, to say the least. There is a kind of very interesting postscript to that Henry had basically stolen some of the materials for his tomb from his chief minister, Thomas Wolsey, who was one of the first kind of Renaissance patrons in England. And he'd had a coffin made for himself out of porphyry. And it then was just sort of lying around the royal vaults for a while. And then when Nelson died and was given a state funeral, the king decided it could be dusted off. And so, in fact, the tomb intended for first Cardinal Wolsey, stolen for Henry VIII, is now where Horatio Lord Nelson is buried in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Now, Edward didn't do very well either. He was just popped in alongside Henry VII, his short reign overlooked by the challenges of female monarchy that followed it. What then, to complete the picture of Mary, and perhaps more significantly of Elizabeth, Gloriana herself? Somewhat surprisingly, they are buried together. Elizabeth had done nothing about the tomb of her sister Mary, despite the wishes expressed in Mary's will. So it was left to James VI, now also James I of England, to arrange a sort of two for the price of one deal. He built a tomb and buried them both there, surely the world's most uneasiest tomb mates. The tomb is grand enough, though there isn't much trace of Mary. You have to read the Latin plaque to know she's in there. There was only room for one effigy, and the effigy chosen was that of Elizabeth. But here, James decided on something really quite radical. This effigy, as you can see, is not an image of an ageless goddess. This is Gloriana unmasked for posterity. This is the figure of an old, frail, mortal woman. Moreover, this tomb is in a side chapel on the unfashionable north side of the abbey, a dead end for a dead-end dynasty. Monarchy had marched on, and to paper over the cracks and to emphasize the arrival of a new dynasty, his dynasty, King James built a new set of tombs for his mother and grandmother on the south side of the abbey, the side which celebrated inherited power. The tomb of Mary Stuart, James's mother, with its coffered ceiling and its colourful statues, outshines the monument to Elizabeth, the woman who had ordered, of course, her execution. The message was clear. The end of the Tudors signalled their failure. The ruler marched on, and the Stuarts were, for now, the future. Thank you very much.